Push and pull. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about mass because essentially mass is what we use to define our shapes, our spaces. So a sculptor works with mass, forming shape out of sort of a solid mass that is sort of compared to the void around it. It's sort of like they create objects that stand as figures within the middle of negative space. But architects and level designers, on the other hand, like us, are primarily concerned with the sculpting of not objects, but of space, a void. I mean, it is true that an architect and a level designer may design an object or building, that sort of thing, to be seen from the outside, but it's very much in relation to sort of the user experience, the player experience, and what shape their experience at the time. And so the player and how they move through spaces is paramount. So in order to do that, we use mass to create meaningful shapes for meaningful space, that is, that our players can move through. So talking about mass, we've gone over this a little bit in the previous section, but mass in our levels exudes positivity. It creates positive spaces out of the void. But it also influences player path, as we're about to see, and it occludes objects, which we'll go into after that. So in a void space where I uniformly sort of place figures, you would end up with, I guess, a very uniform desire to go sort of anywhere. So here, sort of, I mean, you could travel, if this is a top-down, you could travel north, west, east, south. None of those things seem to have any special purpose or meaning because there's not really any contrast from one space to another. You might as well choose any direction. So when none of your choices make any difference, then you really have no choice or no meaningful choice. But that sort of starts to fall away as you sort of remove some of these figures. So now we have a contrast of space of sort of this more negative space to positive space. And so, we look at in real spaces and in our levels that the sort of positive to negativity is a bit sort of lopsided. So let's take a look at some examples. So we've got two sort of positive spaces that we're creating out of these shapes here. So on the left-hand side, we've got maybe imagine as that this is top-down. We have a building and a larger building on the right, and we've got this alleyway that sort of goes between them. Here on the right side, we've got maybe the corner of a parking lot or something, and we've got these columns that sort of stand here, or maybe this is a building in a corner of a parking lot, and these are doors or windows that are opening into it. So now we're going to take a look at sort of how these positive spaces kind of exude, or I'm sorry, how these figures exude sort of a positive space feeling on these spaces. And as you can see, it's very sort of lopsided. We sort of have these on the left side, strong positivity on the left and the right, and in this example on the far right, we've got sort of a strong positive feeling sort of in the corner. And here is sort of our magnetic lines to sort of show, kind of demonstrate sort of the imaginary forces that are here at work. And this is all perceptual. This isn't, real life, that sort of thing. But this is sort of how these kind of influence player movements. So it's almost as if sort of the player is sort of moving through this space. They're sort of pulled from the negative space to negative space because the positive sort of pushes in on them, and it's kind of like as if this is water through a pipe. The sides of the pipe are pushing
in on the player's intentionality, and they're drawn from negative space to negative space. So an alleyway like this very much draws the player through it very straight and very, very quickly. In this example here on the right, we have shapes that are sort of pushing in lots of different directions, creating a very sort of turbulent sort of shape. And sort of as the player tries to move through it, they're pushed and pulled by a lot of different influencing positivity and negative factors. And this is sort of, in theory, I guess, how a positive space encourages a player to linger, to look around, to hide in here. So let's look a little bit more at full-on geometry instead of just being in top-down theory. So here on the right side of the screen, we've got this large block, and it's sitting on this plane of grass, I imagine, that sort of thing. Now, we're all probably familiar with this concept of normals, and this is sort of, I've made the normals visible on the surface. So normal is essentially when there is a plane, the normal of that plane is essentially a vector directly out from that plane. So in this case, we have this wall. All of the vectors are pointing out away from that wall. And very much, at least perceptually, at least if I was planning my pathway through this space, these vectors, although I don't see them, they're almost like these are sort of vectors are arrows or forces pushing out against me. They're telling me that my path cannot go through that object, so I'm going to have to find a way around. But on the other hand, over here on this left side, we've got this negative space that's sort of pulling at me. So in that space, I see possibility. I see places that I can travel. So I've got this sort of push from the positive space, from the figure, and this pull from the negative space, from the void. And so if I'm coming at this space from this sort of angle, and this is my intentionality, very much these forces are going to be pushing and pulling me in order to kind of go around them. And so once you start to fill in a space with more complicated sort of space shapes, you sort of almost see this sort of turbulence that goes around the figures. And, you know, I mean, truth be told, the player could go anywhere they want to if they're under full control. But, you know, as a designer, you're creating a space that hopefully, you know, hundreds of thousands, millions of people play this. And if you're trying to imagine sort of that sort of scale of people all going through your space at once, you're going to start seeing some trends. And those trends are essentially guided by the normals of your sort of space and the positivity and the negativity pulling players through it. And this goes for partial angles as well. So in a case like this, where we have a bit of a hill right here, we imagine the normals sort of pushing up and away, and they're sort of pushing out to the side a little bit. Now I could possibly like go directly over this hill, but the positivity of the space is sort of pushing me to sort of perceive these pathways around it. And so when you start to sort of combine spaces, combine shapes, you'll start to sort of see trends of where the normals sort of lead players on sort of paths through them and around objects, almost very much like they are, this is sort of water in a stream, like a waterfall, sort of down a river coming down through the mountains, that sort of thing. Much like liquid, the player intentionality sort of fills the space and is guided by the boundaries.